Hello, everybody. It's Dr. Wendy Walsh, and it must be Wednesday because I've got my glass of wine because it's wine with Dr. Wendy, and I have some amazing minds. I don't know how amazing we'll be after a few glasses of wine and we talk about this subject tonight, but let me introduce you to my guest tonight. First of all, we have a lawyer in Boston, Massachusetts, Annie Kerrick, and Annie also works as a Title IX coordinator. I'm sorry, Annie, I got you mixed up. You were at Boise State. Sorry, in Boise, Idaho. You are a Title IX coordinator at Boise State. And then we have Djuna Perkins, who's over there in Boston, Mass., also a lawyer, former prosecutor, and she is a sexual misconduct investigator on college campuses. We have my ever intrepid Laura Hampikian, my producer. I'm Dr. Wendy Walsh here in Los Angeles. Laura, you're in Boise, too. We have two of you in Boise tonight. We're putting Boise on the map with this show. Tonight's topic was spurred by legislation that is beginning in the state of California. It's passed one level, and it's now up for debate by lawmakers. And if this new bill passes, it basically says that before anyone can have sex legally on a college campus that receives state funds in the state of California, you would have to receive written or verbal consent. Yes, consent. Like you have to actually sign a contract before you can hook up. So we're going to talk about really what is consent, what does it mean, and of course I've got the lawyers to help me define it. Why don't we start with you, Annie? When you first heard about this law, what did you think?
Well, I think it's a good idea. I know that I have always encouraged people to seek affirmative consent. You know, just saying, simply waiting for a no is not enough. The person that you're looking to have sexual activity with needs to be excited and happy and just as into it as you are. So I think it's definitely a good idea to put that as an expectation that we want our population to seek a good, clear consent.
And we mustn't forget, of course, that the point of this law is to reduce the amount of misunderstandings that end up in date rape and in the courts, which are not a good thing that's happening to young women or men on campus. But Djuna, let me go to you. I mean, Annie said she likes this law. My question is, how practical is this law? You know, one of the tenets of giving consent is just because you have say yes to one sexual activity doesn't mean that you're saying yes to every sexual activity. See, the wine's kicking in already. I'm saying sex. And the question is this: do you envision young adults saying, okay, may I kiss you now? Yes. May I touch you now? Yes. May I move down here now? Is this what it's going to be? Is this practical?
I mean, it's in Massachusetts, most colleges here, the cutting edge for student misconduct policies on the college campuses themselves is exactly this. It's affirmative consent, so it's already here. It's already happening. You know, and most of the cases I handle revolve around this very issue. You know, oftentimes it'll be, you know, the woman who says, you know, I'm willing to hook up with you, I'm willing to even do oral sex, but I don't want to have sex. And then if it goes to that point of having sex, then yes, it does call into play the affirmative consent policy. It's difficult, that's for sure, because it's very fact specific, and you have to really be careful about, you know, looking at every single detail of what happened between these two people. But it's not, you know, but it's not impossible. But what I think is even more important about it is the shift that it would create in really social thinking, because of course this is not just a college campus issue, this is a societal issue, and it's only because we get these little microcosms of, you know, on college campuses of the universe that we get to see it happening here, and we get to say, hey, colleges, you got to do something about it. I mean, if the city of Boston or the city of LA or Boise had to publish Clery statistics about the crimes on their campuses, I think we'd be having a really different conversation.
Yeah, that is so true. I think it's creating this big cultural shift, but the first wave of it is sort of shocking to some people, and I think some of us, even when we began composting, found that shocking, or bringing our own grocery bags into a store, found that shocking, and now we're all doing it. So, Annie, I want to go back to you for a minute, because you're a Title IX coordinator, and my understanding was that Title IX was all about getting money into women's sports, but now it's about preventing date rape. Can you explain that?
Yeah, Title IX really was enacted to provide equal access to educational opportunities for men and women, and early on that was construed as providing opportunity for equal athletic opportunity, but now we know that sexual assault and sexual harassment is a real barrier for some students to continue in their education, especially when their assailant may be in their classes, maybe in their dormitory. that type of thing. So we know that if there's a barrier to education and it's based on gender, which sexual assault is, that it's a Title IX issue.
That's fascinating. So that you're there. So if there's a student watching right now, is there a kind of Title IX coordinator that she could reach out to at her institution to enable her to still have access to education as she, if she is a survivor of sexual assault?
Yeah, absolutely. So every institution that receives federal funding, whether that be research funds for, any type of research professors are doing, federal financial aid, or other types of federal funding, has to have a Title IX coordinator in place at that institution who can, and that coordinator will be able to help a student navigate the process, hopefully put in place some interim measures to keep them safe and comfortable on campus, keep them in class, and then let them continue their education until they are completed.
Good to know. Good information. Djuna, I have a question for you because you sort of know this social change intimately. Does consent always have to be verbal? Can you give consent with your body or body language?
Yes, and many of my cases revolve around just that. I mean, so when I'm doing interviews with students, I'm asking very detailed questions about what their body positions were, who did what when, who took off the clothes, how did the clothes come off, did you lift your body up so that he could take the pants down, who turned you around? All of that stuff is definitely part of that. Which I think most people don't think about when they start complaining about affirmative consent policies. Oh, that's so ridiculous. I should also say that there's a very popular public relations PR campaign right now called Consent is Sexy, and it actually, it's distributed on campuses nationwide that talks about just this, that getting explicit consent, because of course the verbal kind is the most clear kind, although even then you can get yeses that really mean nos. Because the person is really kind of ambivalent and she's just doing it because she doesn't know what else to do or because she's been convinced into doing it, at least from her standpoint. So even verbal consent is not necessarily the most clear consent sometimes.
Dr. Wendy, I'd like to take a moment and go over what I call consent so that anyone watching right now can understand. The rules of consent are simple. Yes means yes. No means no. Silence does not mean yes. Secondly, that it is the responsibility of both partners in a sexual relationship to obtain consent from each other. The third is that nobody can give consent if they are under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Now, by the way, Annie, that's one that's challenged a lot because how much sex happens in the world without drugs and alcohol? Just saying. But well, where's the line drawn, Annie, on that one?
To be realistic, that's true. A lot of sex happens when drugs or alcohol are involved. And I know when I'm looking at my campus and when in my previous life, what I would look at is hitting that point of incapacitation. Is a person so intoxicated that they don't have the capacity to say yes? So there's certain factors you can look for to determine that. Were they able to stand? Were they able to talk? Were they passed out? So we're definitely not saying that after you have a sip of wine, like we all like to have occasionally.
You're saying I can't give consent tonight?
Right. We're not saying that, but what we're saying is that if you know that someone is incapacitated because you see it, you hear it, then you should know that they cannot give consent to sexual activity.
And of course, one of the sort of difficulties in overcoming this issue is the fact that, of course, men and women metabolize alcohol very differently. And men tend to project their body's experience of alcohol on women. So in other words, oh, she only had like 4 beers. But 4 beers when a chick weighs $110 and she hasn't been drinking very much can put her over the legal limit, correct?
Absolutely. And something I see, generally speaking, I won't say this is always a rule, is that I see women, young women especially, drink a lot more without eating ahead of time, which also affects how the alcohol, which also really causes some problems.
Yeah, well, the research on alcohol is really interesting because it's not just about body weight. It's not just about how much food is in your stomach or not, although those are important factors. But the simple fact that men and women metabolize alcohol very differently. So anyway, the other thing I wanted to ask you about is this idea. I was going through my consent thing, and there was something that came up. This responsibility that both partners are to ask for consent. there is this assumption that men want sex all the time and that men should be ready to have sex. And in fact, in what I call our high supply sexual economy, we have a lot of women who are adopting what they believe is a male model of sexuality because they think that's cool. And there are young men who have actually told me, they don't define it as rape because they don't understand the ramifications, but they're like, you know, this chick was so just forcing it on me and I didn't know what to do. So I think the message needs to get out there to both young men and women that they both need to fairly get consent. Do you agree? Let's go with Djuna.
Yes, I mean, and most of the policies I see actually on college campuses say things like, it is the burden, the responsibility is on the initiator of any sexual act to obtain consent. So they are kind of equal opportunity policies in that if you're the woman and you're initiating the act. And of course, I think socially for most men to say, you know, I don't know how many men, some men would be thrilled that the woman is initiating a sexual act. They would never think to complain about it, whether she asked or not. But others, I think you're right, that there are a number who would be afraid to say that it bothered them because it's not manly.
Yeah, because we have really pushed men into a very narrow bandwidth of acceptable male sexual behavior right now, and that is take all sex, any sex, at any cost. And that doesn't reflect the sexualities of most young men, actually, especially if we believe the research that shows that only about 5% have multiple partners over the course of a few years. Women, on the other hand, by the way, are being forced into what I call an even narrower bandwidth, which is have plenty of not too much sex, because they're being encouraged by our highly sexualized culture to put out, if you will, but they're also, you know, subject to the double standard where women are not respected. Another thing I wanted to bring up, because I want our women viewers to really understand this, is one of the most dangerous things that goes on socially, talking about social habits in our culture, is the token no used as foreplay. So when a woman, in wanting to preserve her reputation because she's believing the double standard, a young woman will often say, no, I probably shouldn't, or I don't always do this, or no, we probably shouldn't go too far. And then she does this enough, very coyly and excitedly, as she's also taking off her clothes, and the next thing you know, the event happens. So it's training a generation of young men to literally not respect the word no. It's a token no to them. And I think the responsibility is on women to use their words wisely. Annie, are you aware of this trend?
I'm not aware of that trend. I've never had that come up in anything that's come through my office. Usually people's stories of what happened lines up pretty consistently, and if a no's involved, both take it as a no and stop activity, and then it starts up later again.
What do you think is the biggest mistake that young people make on campuses that end them up in your office?
I think, honestly, the biggest mistake that's made, obviously, you know, rapists cause rape, but there's a whole lot of people that can step in along the line and be a really strong active bystander and set a model that that behavior is not acceptable. And unfortunately, I think that fails to happen because of peer pressure and a lot of other societal pressures. We're just not expected to step into what we see as other people's business when really we should.
Yeah.
Wendy, could I jump in for a second?
Yeah.
I just wanted to go back to your question before. You know, I don't see women coming in and having been coy and saying no but meaning yes. I don't think I've really ever seen that. More often I see the opposite, where a woman says yes because of pressure and persistence when she really doesn't want to. And she kind of gets convinced into it, or feels like it's the nice girl thing to do. I'm supposed to. It's polite. We went out to dinner, you know, or he took me out to dinner, or he's trying to pleasure me, and I still don't really want to do anything else. But I feel like I'm supposed to. I feel obligated. That's far more common.
I did a pilot, a dating show pilot for NBC a couple months ago, and the female comedian who hosted it was hysterical. And Eliza Schlesinger is her name. She has a great comedy act on Netflix you should watch. But she talks about this. She talks about women ordering the lobster and then not even giving a hand job later. Of course, she's being facetious and she's joking, but she's like, you can't go out and order the lobster and expect to just get out, you know, scot-free. Well, of course, legally you can order the lobster and the big towering volcano of chocolate dessert and not have to give him even a kiss. So I want women to understand that. But one advice I would give to young women in that way is to plan the end of the evening at the beginning of the evening. So in other words, know what your goals are, your boundaries are. Don't put yourself in a situation where you're going to feel that pressure, where you're going to be compromised. So if at the beginning of an evening, instead of leaving your options open and thinking, well, I'll decide, I'll see if I like them enough, you know, plan to meet your roommate at a certain time somewhere, plan to something so that you're planning the end at the beginning. I think that advice can help women sort of think things through before perhaps alcohol may take over. Another thing I want to go ahead. Who's that, Laura?
Sorry. The other thing is that that women need to say to themselves, and I say this to my daughter all the time, is if you feel like something is creepy, something is not going the way you think it should, or they start saying, "Oh, come on, if you just let me touch your breast, then I'll stop." That's
right.
Never, trust your instincts. You have to say no, and really make it clear, a clear no, not an ambivalent no, not a sure, I guess so, or maybe he'll stop, because that's not how it stops.
Oh, you know what the big one is, by the way, and they still do it of all ages. Look, we don't have to have sex, but just let me sleep over. We'll just,
right.
I'll sleep over. But now it's 3 in the morning, and it's impractical to kick someone out, and how do you get them past that point? And they're getting more sexually aggressive, if you will, if I can use that word carefully, or more insistent, and then it becomes a whole different question.
Right.
Right, and so that's sometimes when, and I completely agree with your point about, taking risk reduction steps. But sometimes we can't stop the crime. It's the rapist or the assailant who chooses the crime, chooses to commit a crime against someone. And, we know that most assailants know very well the person they're assaulting, and they probably are trusted to that person. And so it may seem reasonable to go, okay, yeah, you can walk me home, or you can stay the night at my house. I trust you. You've never done anything bad in the past. And so we have that expectation that nothing bad will happen in the future. And sometimes that's just not how it ends up.
And sadly, most of those female victims have suffered some kind of early life trauma themselves, and really in their adult lives are going back to the scene of the crime. They're drawn towards it. One of the most disturbing statistics that I found in my research was that 1/3 of American women have suffered some kind of abuse in their childhood, whether it's sexual, physical, emotional, but most often that abuse came at the hand of someone they loved. So as a result, their feelings of love and attraction are all intertwined with also feelings of pain. And this is the place they sort of get drawn back to again in their young adult lives. It's really sad.
Dr. Wendy, I have a question coming in about the realistic, I guess, expectations of affirmative consent as legislation. So it may be a good social practice and a good thing to promote in colleges and maybe make as a college policy, but does the law really have a place in this? And if so, how can the law enforce affirmative consent?
Well, I don't know, Laura. What I would like to say before I throw it to the lawyers is apparently the law likes to get involved in our wombs. That's, well protected inside our bodies. So, let them get involved on dates if it's going to protect us. Lady lawyers, where do you go? Annie, why don't you start?
Well, I believe that the law is mandating, I've skimmed it briefly, and I believe what it is doing is mandating that schools provide certain language in their policies. They have certain expectations for their students, and they do education on those policies and expectations. Now, does that mean in every bedroom, during every sexual encounter, there's going to be really clear verbal consent? No, but we know that then schools are setting that up as an expectation, and I think it's reasonable to have that expectation. I also think even if you can't get a clear verbal consent, there are definitely other ways that you can tell someone is interested in having sex or not interested in having sex. So you have to look at the totality of the circumstances there.
Mm-hmm. I'm Djuna. Well, I was actually going to ask about what are some ways to give consent that isn't, may I kiss you, may I touch you now? Are there sexier ways to give consent?
Djuna, tell us about that Consent is Sexy program.
I mean, I actually don't know that much about it. That's not really, but I just was fascinated by the idea. I mean, I bet, I have a feeling Annie probably knows a little more about it than I do. I mean, have you seen it, Annie?
I have seen it. It's actually, I have it as a screensaver on my computer in my office. But there are lots of ways to give consent. I mean, and I think this law has been kind of put in a bad light because they never define what consent looks like. Well, it is really, really hard to define. And part of it is that if you're in a long-term relationship with someone, you know what they like, and you may know what wearing the pink robe to bed means. Where if it's the first night you're with someone, you don't know what those signs of consent are. And so that makes it really, really important that you do try to get that verbal consent at every step along the way.
At the very least, this law is certainly sparking a lot of conversation, and that alone should be educating people about what is consent.
Absolutely.
Djuna, I know this is sort of it's something that I think about a lot, having to do with these, with rape victims. And that is one of the saddest, most disturbing parts about rape is that sometimes, even if it's an outright stranger rape, but especially date rape, and the woman is feeling some ambivalence, and she may not have been empowered in her life to learn how to fight back and resist in a very strong way, and she thought her word no would be respected, etc. Sadly, often her body responds because our body reacts differently from our brain. So in our brain, we might be saying, oh no, this is an awful event, and at the same time, we might have a spontaneous orgasm. This makes it very hard to convict rapists when this event happens. Have you seen this in your practice, Djuna?
Never. But okay. I mean, I will say that no matter, even if you have a stranger rape where somebody's jumping out of the bushes, it's still incredibly difficult to get a rape conviction. And the reason is because the beyond a reasonable doubt standard is so high. We saw that with O.J. Simpson, which is, I think, just had its 20th anniversary. But more important than that is that the way that the government has to prove rape crime is to say that they have to prove that there was no consent. In what other area of our lives do you have to prove it that way? I mean, if you were going to borrow your neighbor's lawnmower and they weren't home, would you just go and take it, or would you wait for them to come home because you might risk them being mad at you if you didn't? But for some reason in the area of sex, the default is consent, that there was consent, at least in the criminal law. And I think that, feminist legal scholars, I'm sure, would talk about how that goes back to the days when women were considered property and all that. And I'm sure that there's something to that, which is why I think that this law in California is so fascinating and could really be revolutionary because, of course, all major social change starts on college campuses. That really changing the way we think, like, of course, why wouldn't you ask somebody to make sure that they wanted the same thing that you wanted? You wouldn't take a parking spot without making sure it was okay.
But yet you'd take their eggs and enter their bloodstream without permission.
Right. I mean, why do you get to just take sex if you feel like it and let her prove that it was the other way around? It doesn't make any sense.
You know where the first idea, I'm telling stories out of school, I'm going to divulge something from a very long time ago. Of course, I'm too old now to have a reputation, so I can just tell it all. But at one time in the, long time ago, long before kids and motherhood, I had an encounter with an NBA player. And it got to that moment, and I was doing a little kind of gentle pushback in a flirtatious way, but we were already naked. And he literally pushed himself back, walked across the room, stood there naked, big dong hanging, and said to me, I don't take one step closer until I hear the word yes.
Wow.
And this was because he had been through the NBA training program. Of course, I said yes right away, but after that event, we talked about why he did that and what happened. And some of the professional sports organizations are starting to do a really good job of educating young men about consent. So obviously I never used the word no as foreplay ever again in my life. And also he was the first man in my entire life to bring female condoms to the party, which I thought was pretty cool. So the point is, though, that consent is something that's going to have to be understood by the whole population, not just people that are most at risk of, date rape or being accused of rape.
Well,
go ahead.
That's what I would tell. What I would tell my boys is if for no other reason, obviously it's because you respect other human beings, but also if for no other reason than you don't want to get accused of something that you don't want to be accused of, then you make sure.
Right. Make sure using That word, yes. I love the fact that this, and by the way, if you just tuned in, this proposed new California law would mean that in order to have sex on a college campus that receives any state funding in California, you would have to get written or verbal consent for sex. Do you think anybody's going to go so far as to get written consent? Annie?
Probably not. I would love to have, see a third-party mediator in the room negotiating a contract about exactly what will and won't happen and remedies for breach of that contract, but I don't think that's going to happen.
That's going to be the law student roommate.
Right, yeah, that would be me in law school doing that right after we come home from the bars. But no, never say never.
Never say never. Somebody might get a written consent. Laura, do we have any questions in there tonight?
We have many coming in. One is about that maybe gray area. So for both men and women who may be worried about obtaining consent, there is always, well, not always, but there's often a maybe period of getting to know each other where you may not want to go all the way, but I feel like oftentimes we do put it on males to, in a way, convince, in a way, seduce the woman that he's worthy of having sexual relations with her. So I guess to help those who are worried about this, what are some tools that we can give them about seduction, but handling that maybe period with grace?
I think the reason why we're having this conversation is because sex is often happening before a relationship happens. And that's the difference. So it used to be that courtship involved having a lot of conversations, a lot of FaceTime, not the time with an iPhone, real FaceTime. It involved remember the going around the bases? You might have some time of hand-holding, kissing, feeling up, feeling down, and really stretching out. And by the way, I do say this to anyone out there today who is wanting to have an exciting sexual relationship. If you prolong this erotic stage, the beginning stage, the sex, I promise you, will be better. But along the way, you also want to have conversations and get to know the person. And that's really hard if you've just met the person and you've decided you're going to hook up. And again, I want to remind people that a lot of these young people today are entering college as virgins. They're complete newbies, as Djuna said, but they have gotten a lot of sexuality information from the internet. They're stepping up to stage 3 sex at the beginning, threesomes, anal sex. There are a lot of technical virgins in America who have anal sex but not the other, etc. So the physiological part, they seem more advanced, but they're less advanced in the emotional piece, which is about how to convey their needs, how to convey their boundaries to a partner. Djuna, would you agree with me?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I still see it's like they're supposed to be adults, and yet I hear the two sides of the same conversation. Well, he asked if he could see, my room, and I said okay, and I wasn't sure if that meant, I wasn't sure what he meant by that. I thought maybe that meant he wanted to hook up, but I wasn't sure. But I didn't want to have sex. They're like, so why didn't you say? Why are you coming back to my room? Why didn't he say, I'm interested in you, and can this go somewhere? But no, nobody says anything until the most important moment, and that's too late.
Exactly. It's got to happen earlier. If you think they're not talking right before sex and in the bedroom, you should see how they're not talking in their relationships. If I have one more girl who shows me her iPhone and says, what does this text mean? And I look, and it's like weeks of text back and forth, usually a lot of typing by the girl and a couple words here and there by the guy. and they're calling this a relationship. Which is fascinating to me, that they're getting to this point with digital communication and physical communication, but not verbal and not emotional communication. Ladies, I love this conversation we're having tonight. I want to make sure that if people want to get more information, can you be found on the internet? Do you have websites and such and books?
Yes.
Annie, how can they find you?
They can absolutely contact me. You can look at my website, which is Dean of Students. Boise State, deanofstudents.boisestate.edu, and I can be found there, and all my contact information is available there, as well as plenty of information on Title IX for those of you who are interested.
I'm more interested in Title IX than I ever have been now that I know sex is involved. Djuna, how can people contact you?
On my website, JunaPerkinsLaw.com.
Fabulous. Thank you, ladies, both of you. I know some of you will. Djuna, you're all the way on the East Coast, so thank you for staying up so late with us. Next week, join us again on Wine with Wendy every Wednesday night at 8 p.m. Pacific, 11 p.m. East Coast time. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.